So one phenomenon that I don't hear talked about as much is my entrepreneurs who are over 40. They've been in business for a decade, or better. They have had thoughts of getting a job, thoughts of quitting, right? Which, those things are actually talked about a little bit more in the marketplace. But the part that's missing from the conversation is this idea of being a seasoned, successful entrepreneur who basically is feeling here's how I say it, they know what to do to reach their goals, right? They know exactly what to do. They know kind of what changes to make when they're pivoting. But the number one problem, the thing that they're experiencing that they often cannot name, is the feeling of being exhausted by the thought of it, right? That's what we want to talk about in this particular episode. And I go much deeper on this in our 5-day course. So definitely check that out. It's linked somewhere around this episode. But let's get into this, okay? So this really is for those of you who are entrepreneurs over 40, like I said, who've been in business for years and years, likely 10, 15, again, sometimes up to 40 years. And specifically, you are dissatisfied. Now, dissatisfied is on a spectrum, right? You could be dissatisfied. Let's say we were going to put this on a scale of 1 to 10. You could be a 1, where you are wishing, maybe I wish I could do more of this or less of this, or I wish I had this, right? Like that counts as being dissatisfied, even if you're not completely unhappy, right? And then there's all the way on the other end of the spectrum. Maybe you're 10 and you literally hate your business, right? No matter where you are on this spectrum of being dissatisfied, this episode is going to support you. Right now, I want to give a little context here is that pivoting is very personal. It's another thing I talk about in the 5-day course that I feel like is just not talked about enough. Pivoting is such an emotional, personal decision, right? And this podcast episode, this podcast as a whole is a great place to be if you're pivoting. But this particular episode is not going to give you the entire picture, right? So if you're someone who's navigating a decision of, do I get a job? Do I not get a job? Do I change this, right? Like this particular episode is designed to aid you in your thinking, right? So it can help you navigate and name the space that you're in. And essentially, what I want to do is give you 3 questions that you can ask yourself. Okay. First, this is not burnout. This is definitely not your typical burnout. Like, to be clear, you're not exhausted from doing the work, right? And let me just say this, there are plenty of entrepreneurs who are burnt out. And there are plenty of entrepreneurs who are burnt out and keep saying they not burnt out. And you may indeed be in that bucket. But just as it relates to this one phenomenon, which is, okay, I'm pivoting, right? I'm starting to lay out my plan to pivot. I'm starting to lay out the pieces. I've already built a 6-figure business. I've already been in business a decade. So I know what to do, right? But every time I start thinking about the plan and the vision that I have, I get tired, right? So this is not your typical burnout because you're not exhausted from doing the work. You're exhausted from thinking about doing the work the way you've always done it, right? And so your brain and your body is saying, I am not willing to pay the price again, right? Because there's a good chance that that first business, this last season, right, cost you some things, right? So here are the couple of things that I really want you to be mindful of. Number one, you have to learn to honor your dissatisfaction. I see so many entrepreneurs that tend to avoid their feelings, right? They tend to view feelings as a distraction, right? And that's how they end up crying in the car and crying in the shower and, kind of having these breakdowns because they're just pushing their feelings down, down, down. And then they come up when they want to come up. Okay. I also talk about that in the email course. And so because so many entrepreneurs tend to avoid their feelings and they don't necessarily know how to feel their feelings, they tend to downplay their dissatisfaction until they're on the higher end of that scale. But the beauty of this is that you could be a 2 and make changes because that's what your feelings are actually for. They're designed to be an alert, whether it's a good feeling or a bad feeling, it's designed to say, hey, we really like this. We should keep doing it. Or, ooh, we really do not like this and we should change it. Right. So if you ignore your level 2 dissatisfaction or level 5 dissatisfaction, it only gets worse over time. Right. So the first thing I want you to be able to hear is that you actually have to honor the dissatisfaction that you're feeling in your life or business. Right. What we don't want to do is just keep working and end up making a decision by default rather than by design, because that's what often happens. Right. You get sick and now you're like, oh man, I need to change something in my business. Or, you're having to take more time off because elder care or whatever. It could be any number of reasons, industry stuff, personal stuff, right? But my point is that you already knew you were dissatisfied. Right now in this moment, you know you are dissatisfied, even if you are not at the other end of that spectrum. Okay. And what doesn't work is to be making decisions by default, like being backed into a corner and then having to make a decision. Sometimes that happens, but we often don't make the best decision in those moments, right? Because we're already full of emotion. So our main step one is just to commit to make a decision. Like we're just gonna make a decision about what to do about that dissatisfaction. Right? You have to give yourself space to simply decide. It could be a day, it could be a week, it could be a month, right? Whatever you actually need to make the decision. And the goal here is to actually decide what changes you will make, not to actually make said changes. Right? Like this is not a 6-month plan to make the changes. This is the 1 or 2 week plan to actually make the decision about what needs to change. Notice the difference there. We're not actually implementing the changes. That's another thing that entrepreneurs tend to do. They tend to go straight to execution and then wonder why the execution doesn't work. Oh, we need the day, the week, the month, whatever, right, to actually decide what needs to change. Right? I recommend somewhere between 30 and 90 days. I know that's going to sound crazy. It's like, girl, you do not need 30 or 90 days. Fair. Okay. I think you can make a decision to pivot in a day, in an hour, in a moment. But I'm not asking you to decide to pivot. Deciding if I will pivot or not is a quicker decision. What I'm asking you to decide is what needs to change. It's kind of like deciding if you're going to stay in your marriage or not, or what's the best way for you to actually lose the weight you're trying to lose, or like there is a very there's a lack of strategy. I know that sounds crazy in the online space that talks about strategy all the time, but really what we're doing is planning, which is a whole different thing. It's not strategy. Okay. So what I'm asking you to do is to take a week or two to decide what needs to change. Okay. Here's the second thing. I'm also asking you not to panic. I'm also asking you not to decide emotionally. Right. And especially, I want to put this caveat here, is when you are feeling something that is, air quote, out of integrity, right? My clients have such a core value around integrity, even when they don't use that as their top 3 values, it is so wired into who they are, right? A lot of my clients are what I would call helpers. They're givers. They just want to help people. And that just desiring to help people comes across as integrity, as a core value of integrity, right? And while that sounds great, we all want to be people of integrity. So it sounds great, but in our attempts to be in integrity, that too is an emotional space, right? Like wanting to make sure, like being so committed to doing right by people can put you in an emotional space. It doesn't just have to be these more negative emotions like sadness or, right? Like, so I want you to be mindful of that too, right? I want to do a whole episode on the difference between making decisions from your values versus making decisions from your vision. A lot of times your values create false urgency. Not always. Sometimes we're just ignoring our values altogether. Okay. That's a whole nother conversation. But a lot of times things like integrity create this false urgency, right? And really what values are designed to do is to help you get clear on what needs to change. But scarcity often leads to the timeline in which you make those changes. Okay, so growing specifically as a CEO requires that you move from operating primarily from your values and more so from your vision. Again, I'm going to do a whole podcast about that, but my point here is that let's not panic. The decisions that you need to make, right? Let's not make them hastily. That's what the space is for, right? That's why I'm asking you to take a day, a week, a month, whatever, right? To actually decide here are the things that need to change in my life, in my business, in order for me to be more fulfilled and less dissatisfied. I am of the firm belief that often what we really want, we can have, right? And it doesn't have to be with this drastic change. Now, again, sometimes drastic changes are necessary, okay? But less about external kinds of changes and always, almost always, about internal changes in order for you to get more of what you want. Let's say I want to be more profitable. I want maybe my revenue is okay, but my personal income, meaning the amount I'm actually taking home, is not the number I want. Let's just use that as an example. And it's like we often focus on the external things that need to change in order to reach that personal goal, right? In order to increase our level of satisfaction. And there will be things that you need to change externally, right? There's no question about that. But the real work is in the internal. The real work, right, is in the decisions that you have to make in order to actually make that goal. That's what makes it hard. In order for you to have what you want with this pivot, in order for you to have more of what you desire, you have to focus more on being internally led and less on being externally driven. That's the message. Okay. Another example I think is a good way to kind of think about this is that let's say that you are someone who's thinking about going back and getting a job, right? And you're like, man, I'm over 40. It's taking a lot of effort and a lot of energy. And, I could fix this and I could fix this, but I could also just go get a job, right? And let's say you're wrestling with that. Well, getting a job is the external solution to the problem that you're experiencing. Doesn't make it wrong. Doesn't mean don't do it, but it is an external solution. You know what else could solve the problem? Doubling your prices. But guess what doubling your prices mostly is? It's an internal decision. Are there things you'd have to do in your business in order to warrant, the changes in your pricing? Sure. But mostly doubling your prices is an internal decision. You see the difference? Internally led versus externally driven. And what I want you to realize is that your happiness is achieved primarily from the internal, not the external. Okay? In order to be internally led instead of externally driven, you'd have to learn to live by design, not by default. Right? Because when you're externally driven, it means that you're living by default. But when you are internally led, you are living by design. Okay. I could go into a whole thing about that, but I will not. Okay. Here are the 3 questions that I want you to consider. Okay. Number 1, what do you need the business to provide for you? Just think about that. Think about 3 to 5 metrics is what I might call them, right? These are essentially your definition of success, right? These are the 3 things, the 4 things, the 5 things, whatever, that you need the business to provide for you. So a good example of this, I was talking to a client not long ago who has an e-commerce brand and a service-based business, right? And what we found is that he's out of alignment between his core values and how his business operates. Okay. And essentially what I mean by that is he is an impact person through and through. Like in all, it just he just impact, but like he's an impact driven entrepreneur, right? But his business did not reflect that. Sure, there are small things that he does from time to time related to his business, uh, that are impactful. Of course, yes, but he was not centering impact, and not everyone needs to center impact, unless you are an impact driven person, right? It's like if you are an impact driven person, which I would count myself to be an impact driven person. Anybody who's in a helping profession, you'd have to be an impact driven person uh to stay in a profession like that for all kinds of reasons. You're not in it for the money, to be clear, okay? And so I want you to be able to align your core value, right, with your business. So let's say it's not impact for you. Let's say it's freedom, right? Like you really want to be able to have, the laptop lifestyle, or you really want to have the freedom to choose, or financial freedom. Like freedom could look a lot of different ways. The question is, are you centering that in your business? Have you defined your success using your core values? That's an example of what I mean by number one. What do you need the business to provide for you? Number two, what is the time frame you need each of these things to happen? Okay. There is a big difference between I am 3 months behind on my car payment, right? Or some other bill, for example, versus I don't have enough money for retirement. They feel the same in a lot of ways, especially if you're in your 20s, then retirement doesn't feel the same. But if you're 45 and you're 50 and you feel like, man, I haven't been putting enough money in my retirement since I started my business, or, whatever, it's like, oh, that feels very urgent. Right? And both require that you change something, but not with the same strategy. This is where, again, sometimes scarcity can come into play. And all of this helps you determine, should I get a job? Should I pivot this part of my business? Should I double my prices? Whatever it is that you're already considering pivoting, these are the questions that are going to help you decide from a more logical space and not an emotional space. Okay. All right. So that second question was, what is the time frame you need each of these things to change, each of these things to happen? Okay. Last one. What would it take to get those metrics from your business? How would you have to change, in essence? What would have to change in your business? So it's kind of like a twofold thing, right? The overarching question is, what would it take to get those metrics? That's the question. There are things that you would have to change, and there are things that would have to change in the business. Those are the questions that I want you to ask yourself to help you get closer to which direction you should be going with whatever you're thinking about pivoting. Okay. I just want to encourage you, sit with the questions, really take the time. Again, it could be taking an hour and going for a walk. It could be going to Starbucks and journaling. It could be like, when I say take the time, I don't mean you have to take months and months and months, right? I mean, separate time for you to think and not just do. Doing comes after the thinking, not before. Okay? All right. So hopefully this was helpful to you. Again, make sure that you check out our 5-day free email course. It'll help you pivot strategically, and it covers some of the things that we talked about in this episode with more in-depth conversation.